For 8 years he sent me certified letters telling me my rent was going up. Yesterday I slipped a letter under his door. I think I finally understand what closure actually feels like. My name is Margaret Calloway, and I have lived in apartment 4B at 1147 Birchwood Avenue, Columbus, Ohio, for the past 8 years. I moved in when I was 33, freshly divorced, carrying 2 suitcases and a very specific kind of exhaustion that comes from dismantling a life you thought was permanent. The apartment was not glamorous. It had low ceilings, a kitchen window that looked directly into a brick wall, and radiator heat that clanged through the night like a small ghost was trapped inside. But it was mine. Or rather, it was rented, which, for a woman starting over in a mid-sized Midwestern city with a paralegal salary and no cosigner, was more than enough. The landlord's name was Gerald Fitch. Gerald was 67 years old, though he carried himself like a man who had been 67 since approximately 1987. He wore pressed khakis and collared shirts even when doing property inspections. He drove a tan Buick that he washed by hand every Saturday morning. He had a handshake that lasted exactly 1 pump and eyes that moved over you with the careful assessment of a man pricing livestock at auction. I remember the day I signed my lease. Gerald sat across from me at a folding table in the building's basement. He always conducted lease signings in the basement, which I later understood was a deliberate atmospheric choice, and slid the papers toward me with 2 fingers. "Miss Calloway," he said, "not Ms., never Ms. I run a tight building. Rent is due on the 1st. I do not accept partial payments. I do not negotiate on late fees. And every year at renewal, the rent reflects current market conditions." "What does that mean exactly?" I asked. He smiled for the first and, I believe, last time in our acquaintance. "It means I always get what the market will bear." I signed anyway. The apartment was in a decent neighborhood, close to my office, and I was tired of looking. The 8-year education. What Gerald meant by current market conditions was this: every single year, without exception, my rent increased. Year 1, $1,150 per month. Year 2, $1,220. Year 3, $1,310. Year 4, $1,420. Year 5, $1,500. Year 6, $1,625. Year 7, $1,780. Year 8, $1,950. Each increase arrived as a certified letter, formal and clipped, containing a lease renewal addendum and a line that read, "Rent adjusted to reflect current market valuation per Section 7(b) of your original lease agreement." I had, of course, signed a lease that gave him full discretion over annual pricing. I had not understood what that meant when I was 33 and exhausted and signing papers in a basement. I understood it very well by 39. Every year I considered leaving. I made spreadsheets. I am a paralegal. Spreadsheets are a love language, comparing my rent to comparable units across Columbus. And every year, frustratingly, Gerald's increases landed just below the threshold where moving would have saved me meaningful money after accounting for first month, last month, security deposit, moving costs, and the psychological toll of dismantling a home again. It was almost mathematical in its precision. Gerald Fitch understood, instinctively or by calculation, exactly how much inconvenience a tenant would absorb before fleeing. He priced himself accordingly. He was not a warm man. When the radiator clanged, he took 6 days to send a repairman. When the bathroom tile cracked, he replaced it with a slightly different shade that he seemed not to notice, and I was not permitted to complain about per Section 12(a) of my lease. When I once asked if I could plant a small window box of herbs on my exterior sill, he sent me a written notice citing building policy, which prohibited tenant modifications to exterior surfaces including but not limited to ledges, railings, and facades. The other tenants, there were 8 units in the building, lived in the same careful resignation. We knew each other the way people know neighbors they have weathered together, not as friends exactly, but as witnesses. There was Darnell in 2A, a schoolteacher who had been there 11 years. There was Patricia in 1C, retired, who once told me over the mailboxes that she had tried to negotiate her renewal 3 years ago and Gerald had responded with a written warning about her recycling habits. There was young Tobias in 3B who had moved in 2 years prior, looked at his first renewal letter, and immediately began researching condominiums. We were Gerald Fitch's tenants. It was a specific condition of life. The first sign that something was shifting came in the spring of my 7th year, when Gerald appeared at the building on a Tuesday, not his usual Saturday inspection day, driving a different car. It was a silver Honda Accord, practical and anonymous, and seeing Gerald Fitch emerge from a Honda rather than his tan Buick was the kind of small wrongness that lodges in the back of your mind. He walked the building without explanation, checking the laundry room, the basement, the parking lot. He had a clipboard and wrote nothing on it. He left without speaking to anyone. I mentioned it to Donnell in the hallway afterward. "Ha," Donnell said. He had the teacher's gift for neutrality. "Did you notice the Buick is gone?" I had noticed. We both had. Over the following months, small things accumulated. The property tax notice that arrived in the communal mail area, misdelivered, addressed to Gerald's LLC, that I did not read but noted had a yellow second notice stamp across the front. A contractor who came to inspect the roof spent 45 minutes up there and left without beginning any work. A phone call I half overheard in the parking lot one evening, Gerald's voice carrying the tight, measured quality of a man discussing something he does not want to discuss. I am a paralegal. I have spent 15 years watching attorneys gather information. I know what it looks like when a situation is quietly developing. In February of my 8th year, I did what any reasonable person with legal research skills, public records access, and a healthy distrust of basements does. I pulled Gerald Fitch's financials. Not his personal finances. I had no access to those and no right to them. But his LLC, Fitch Property Holdings LLC, was a registered business entity in Ohio, which meant certain records were public. I looked up his property holdings first. 1147 Birchwood Avenue was not, I discovered, Gerald's only building. He owned 3 properties in Columbus and had, until approximately 4 years ago, owned 2 more. Those 2 had been sold. The remaining 3 each carried mortgage liens of record. That was normal. What was less normal was a UCC lien filing from 18 months ago, a business creditor who had secured an interest in his property assets. I sat with that for a while. Then I pulled court records. Fitch Property Holdings LLC was named in a civil suit filed 14 months ago by a construction company, Meridian Build Group, for unpaid invoices totaling $284,000. The suit had proceeded through discovery and was now in pre-judgment posture. Meridian had filed for a judgment lien. I leaned back in my chair and looked at my kitchen wall, the brick one, the one that had faced me for 8 years, and I thought about what $284,000 in unpaid construction debt meant for a small-time landlord who had quietly sold 2 of his 5 properties and was driving a Honda instead of a Buick. I thought about it for a long time. Update 1, the research phase. I want to be clear about something. I did not plan to do anything with this information, at first. I am not, by nature, a vengeful person. I am methodical and I have a strong preference for fairness, which is not the same thing as cruelty. What I felt, sitting with Gerald Fitch's financial difficulties spread across my laptop screen, was not glee. It was something more complicated, the specific feeling of a person who has been squeezed for years watching the mechanism of the squeeze begin to buckle. I kept researching. Not as a plan, but because that is what I do when something has my attention. What I learned, over the following 6 weeks, Gerald Fitch had over-leveraged himself badly during the pandemic years, purchasing 2 additional commercial properties in 2021 at peak pricing using variable rate financing. When rates rose, so did his debt service. The commercial properties were bleeding cash. The residential buildings, including mine, were his cash flow, which explained why he had been maximizing rent income so aggressively. He had been using us as a subsidy for bad bets elsewhere. The Meridian judgment came through in March. $291,000 including interest and attorney's fees, reduced to a lien against his property assets. I called my friend Diane, who is a real estate attorney in Columbus, and asked her a hypothetical. Hypothetically, I said, if a landlord were heading toward bankruptcy and one of his residential buildings was likely to go to auction, what would a tenant in that building want to know? Diane was quiet for a moment. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking hypothetically. Hypothetically, she said, a tenant would want to know that Chapter 7 bankruptcy for a property holding LLC typically results in assets being liquidated by the trustee. Properties go to auction, sheriff's sale in Ohio. The auction is public. Anyone can bid. There are no tenant right of first refusal laws in Ohio for residential tenants in most circumstances, so a tenant has no automatic priority. But a tenant who shows up prepared and capitalized can absolutely bid. And hypothetically, I said, what would someone need to be prepared? A pre-approval letter from a lender. Knowledge of the property's condition, which a long-time tenant might reasonably have. Comparable sales research. And patience, Diane said. These processes move slowly and then suddenly very fast. I hung up and opened a new spreadsheet. Update 2. Becoming prepared. I have been a paralegal for 15 years. I have worked primarily in civil litigation and, for the past 6 years, in real estate and property law. I understand mortgage documents. I understand title searches. I understand how to read a settlement statement. This is relevant context for what followed. Over the next 4 months, I did the following things with deliberate, unhurried care. First, I got my finances in order. I had been contributing aggressively to my savings for 3 years, partly discipline, partly because each rent increase had functioned as an alarm clock, reminding me that I was subsidizing someone else's asset appreciation without building any of my own. I had $47,000 in liquid savings. I spoke to my credit union, with whom I had banked for 11 years, about pre-approval for a mortgage. The loan officer's name was Carl, and he was thorough and direct. Given my income, my credit score of 781, and my savings, I was pre-approved for up to $280,000. The building at 1147 Birchwood Avenue was a 2-story, 8-unit residential property with a 2-car garage and a partial basement. Based on comparable sales in the area that I researched carefully, I estimated its likely auction value at between $195,000 and $240,000, depending on condition assessment and competing bidders. Sheriff sales in Ohio often, not always, but often, clear below market value. Buyers at auction accept uncertainty, which they price in. I knew this building's condition intimately. 8 years of living in it had given me a specific, embodied knowledge of its systems. I knew the roof had been inspected but not repaired. I knew the boiler was original to the 1988 build. I knew the laundry machines were leased, not owned. I knew that Unit 6A had a slow ceiling leak that Gerald had addressed with paint and prayer. I documented all of this in a condition notes file that I kept updated every week. Second, I hired Diane formally, not just as a friend advisor but as counsel. She filed a records request to monitor the bankruptcy proceedings and ensure I received auction notices promptly. Gerald Fitch LLC filed Chapter 7 in June. The trustee appointed was a woman named Sandra Voss, who had a reputation for efficient, no-nonsense administration. Diane knew her professionally. This was useful. Third, I told Donnell. I told him on a Sunday afternoon, standing in the parking lot while he was unloading groceries. I had thought carefully about whether to do this. Donnell had been here 11 years. He was quiet and responsible and had been subjected to 11 years of Gerald's annual letters. He deserved to know what was coming. The building is going to auction, I told him. Probably in the fall. I'm planning to bid. He set down his grocery bags and looked at me for a long moment. What do you need from me? He said. Right now, nothing. But if I'm successful, I want to talk to you about the building. He nodded slowly. Margaret, he said, if you own this building, I will sign a 5-year lease the same day. Update 3. The auction. The auction was scheduled for the 3rd Thursday of October, at the Franklin County Sheriff's Office on Mound Street. Diane had been monitoring the filings for weeks and confirmed that 1147 Birchwood Avenue was listed as a standalone auction item. The trustee had separated the properties for individual sale rather than bundling, which was favorable. Fewer competing bidders typically showed up for individual residential properties. The morning of the auction, I dressed in what I think of as my professional uniform. Dark slacks, a gray blazer, my good leather flats. I had my pre-approval letter, my certified check for the required deposit, my condition notes, my comparable sales analysis, and my maximum bid figure written on an index card in my coat pocket. The figure was $228,000. I had arrived at it through calculation, not emotion, and I was committed to not exceeding it regardless of what the room did. Diane met me outside the building at 9:15. She was wearing her trial blazer, which I took as a good sign. 3 other registered bidders for this property, she said. An investment group from Cincinnati, probably a rental consolidation play. A flipper, solo operator. And 1 individual I don't recognize. Is Gerald here? He can't bid. He's the bankrupt party. She paused, though nothing prevents him from watching. He was there. I saw him when I walked in, standing against the far wall in a tan jacket that had the look of something worn more carefully than usual, as though he had pressed it specifically for this occasion. He was watching the room with the expression of a man observing surgery on himself. When he saw me, something moved across his face. Not recognition exactly. He knew who I was, of course. Something more like recalibration. I found my seat and did not look at him again. The auction itself was procedurally brisk. The trustee's representative described the property and its encumbrances. The opening bid was set at $142,000, representing the primary mortgage balance. Bidding opened. The Cincinnati Investment Group opened at $155,000. The flipper bid $163,000. The unknown individual, a woman in her 50s who had the demeanor of someone who had done this before, bid $171,000. I waited. This is the thing about auctions that people do not understand. The patience is the strategy. You let others establish the ceiling of their confidence before you establish yours. At $187,000, the flipper dropped out. At $199,000, the unknown woman bid and paused, and I could see her doing the same arithmetic I had done, measuring her remaining appetite. I bid $207,000. The Cincinnati group came back at $212,000. I bid $219,000. The room was quiet. The Cincinnati representative consulted briefly with someone on his phone, then shook his head slightly. The gavel came down. $219,000. Final. I did not celebrate. I exhaled, slowly, and made a note in my spreadsheet. Diane squeezed my arm. "Congratulations," she said quietly. "You just became a landlord." Update 4. The letter and the knock. Closing took 31 days. During that time, I received my first piece of mail addressed to Margaret Calloway, property owner, a title insurance notice from the closing company, and I stood in my kitchen holding it for a full minute before putting it on the counter. I had an electrician walk the building. I had a plumber assess the boiler. I began drafting new lease agreements, fair, clear, detailed documents that Diane reviewed, with a rent structure that reflected actual market rates rather than a landlord's extraction strategy. For Darnell, who had 11 years of loyalty to this building, I offered a rent reduction back to $1,400 from his current $2,050. He accepted it wordlessly and then, unexpectedly, shook my hand with both of his. For the other tenants, I called individual meetings. In the building's basement, a choice I made deliberately, with private acknowledgement of the irony, I sat across a folding table and explained the new ownership, the new lease terms, and my intentions for the building's deferred maintenance. I told them the roof would be addressed before winter. I told them the laundry machines would be replaced. I told them that rent would reflect fair market rates, but that I would not raise it simply because I could. Patricia from 1C cried a little, quietly, and apologized for it. I told her there was nothing to apologize for. Tobias from 3B asked if I was serious about the new lease terms, and when I said yes, he reopened his laptop and closed the Zillow tab he had been consulting. I had been the owner of 1147 Birchwood Avenue for exactly 11 days when I heard a knock at my door on a Saturday morning. I was drinking coffee. I was in my good weekend clothes, not because I had expected anyone, but because I had started doing that, wearing real clothes on weekend mornings rather than staying in the quiet drabness of someone whose life has been slightly provisional for 8 years. Small things. They matter. I opened the door. Gerald Fitch was standing in the hallway of the building where he had been the landlord for, I later calculated, 22 years. He was wearing pressed khakis and a collared shirt, and he held a tan driving cap in both hands, turning it in a small, repeating rotation that I understood immediately to be involuntary. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Fitch," I said. We looked at each other. "May I come in?" he asked. I considered this. Not the asking, I had thought, in the abstract, about whether this moment might come. I had not scripted it or prepared for it emotionally, exactly, but I had considered it. I stepped back from the door. He came in and stood in my living room, looking at it with the particular look of someone recalibrating familiar space. He had been in this apartment perhaps twice in 8 years, both times for inspections, both times moving through it with clipboard efficiency. Now he stood in it differently, a visitor, not an authority. I did not offer coffee. "I understand you purchased the building," he said. "I did. At auction." "At auction." He nodded, still turning the hat. "I wanted to come and—" He paused. "I wanted to come and speak with you directly." "I appreciate that," I said, which was the neutral thing to say, and also, I discovered as I said it, true. I did appreciate it. He could have sent a letter. He could have sent nothing. "I wanted to ask," he said, "whether there was any possibility of—" Another pause, longer this time, with a quality of genuine difficulty in it, "whether there is a unit available." "In the building." The building he had owned for 22 years. I was quiet. Not for effect. I am not a theatrical person, but because the answer to his question required more than a yes or no, and I wanted to give him a real answer, not a performance. 5B is currently vacant, I said. The tenant moved out in August. Gerald nodded. He already knew this, of course. He had known every unit status until 31 days ago. "I'm 67 years old," he said. The bankruptcy has." He stopped, then started again with a different kind of precision, the precision of a man who has rehearsed something he finds humiliating. "My assets are largely liquidated. I am renting a room from my sister in Worthington. I have a modest fixed income. I wanted to ask if you would consider me as a tenant." The word tenant in his mouth had an odd texture, like a word he had only previously encountered in written form. "What can you afford?" I asked. He told me a figure. It was $1,100 a month, which was less than he had charged me for this apartment in year 1. I looked at him, this man who had written me 9 certified letters in 8 years informing me that my rent was increasing to reflect current market conditions. This man who had spent 2 decades pricing human beings at exactly what the market would bear. This man standing in his own former building, turning his hat in his hands, asking me for reasonable rent. I was not cruel about it. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was not triumphant. It was something quieter and more complicated, the specific weight of having a person's dignity in your hands and understanding the responsibility of that. The current market rate for a 2-bedroom in this neighborhood, I said carefully, is approximately $1,400 to $1,600 per month. Something in his face adjusted. However, I continued, my leases include a stability clause. Rent increases are capped at 3% annually, and only if operating costs require it. Not simply because the market permits it. He was still. I would lease you 5B at $1,150 per month, I said. Month to month initially, converting to a 1-year lease after 90 days, contingent on standard tenant criteria. He was quiet for a long moment. He had stopped rotating the hat. Why? He said. Not combatively, with genuine, uncertain curiosity. It was a fair question. I thought about the brick wall, the radiator ghost, the certified letters, the 9 years of absorbing his particular arithmetic of extraction. I thought about Patricia crying quietly in the basement and Darnell with 11 years of loyalty and Tobias closing his Zillow tab. Because I'm not doing this the way you did it, I said. That's the whole point. Resolution. Gerald Fitch has lived in Unit 5B for 6 months now. He pays his rent on the 1st, without exception. I will say that for him. He is, as it turns out, an adequate neighbor, quiet, unobtrusive, prompt with his share of trash duty on the rotation I established for the building's common areas. He does not speak to me often, and I do not seek him out. But last month, when the new boiler was installed and I was standing in the basement supervising the work, he came downstairs and watched for a while without speaking. Then he said, "You should have them check the water pressure regulators while they're in there." He paused. "The ones on the 2nd floor have been uneven for years." "I know," I said. "I've asked them to." He nodded and went back upstairs. It was almost, in a sideways light, something like a conversation between 2 people who understand a building. I have thought about what the past 8 years were and what they mean. I was not a passive participant in my own situation. I chose to stay, year after year, and I made that choice with eyes open and spreadsheets current. I could have left at any renewal. I did not, partly for rational reasons and partly because 4B had become, despite the brick wall and the radiator and the landlord with his clipboard and his certified letters, my home. You do not stop loving a place because the economics are imperfect. But I also think about what Gerald taught me, in the way that difficult teachers do, not by intention but by accumulation. He taught me to read leases carefully, all of them, every section, especially Section 7B. He taught me to track public records and understand the difference between a landlord who is cash-flowing well and one who is subsisting on tenant extraction. He taught me that preparation and patience are more powerful than confrontation. He taught me, without meaning to watch for the moment when a situation changes, and to be ready when it does. The roof at 1147 Birchwood is repaired. The boiler is new. The 2nd floor water pressure, per Gerald's advice, is now even. I have 8 tenants, including 1 former landlord, and a building manager who is Darnell's cousin and who has worked in property maintenance for 12 years. I am 41 years old. I own a building. I live in apartment 4B. The brick wall outside my kitchen window has not changed. Some mornings I drink my coffee looking at it and think about the woman who signed a lease in this basement at 33, tired, starting over, not reading Section 7B carefully enough, and I feel something gentle toward her. She was doing her best with what she had. She paid attention over time. She built something from the wreckage of someone else's overconfidence. That seems like enough. More than enough, actually. Last week I received my first piece of correspondence from one of my own tenants, a formal written request from Gerald Fitch in Unit 5B, asking permission to install a small window box of herbs on his exterior windowsill. I approved it in writing, the same day. I noted, in the approval letter, that it was a reasonable request, and that it was my policy to say yes to reasonable requests. I did not mention that I had once made the same request and received a written notice citing building policy prohibiting tenant modifications to exterior surfaces. I did not need to. Gerald Fitch remembered it without any help from me. I know because when I slipped the approval under his door, I heard him, on the other side of it, exhale. Some lessons arrive slowly. But they arrive. Edit. Since people are asking, yes, Diane charged me actual attorney's fees, and no, I did not get a discount just because we're friends. She says friends don't discount real estate transactions. They just answer hypotheticals for free. She's right. Hire professionals, people. Second edit. Someone in the comments asked if I feel guilty about Gerald. No. I feel responsible, which is different and better.